why did you first get interested in studying animal language?
Well, I first got interested in studying language, human language, and it's such a complex and interesting phenomenon. And in order to understand it, I think you have to look not only into human language but outside of it, right, as well. So actually, I started with a bit of an unusual path. I started as a historical linguist, or um, sometimes also called comparative philologist, which is you study a lot of old dead languages and try to reverse engineer how the mother language of all our languages in Indo-European family speak. So, for example, you have to learn Latin and Hittite and Sanskrit and so on. So all these cool dead languages, and that's what I was pretty much doing in my entire undergraduate and then half of the PhD as well. Um, but then you start realizing, okay, so there are some really complex questions in language, right? How did it evolve, right? We know that animals don't have the same language as we have, and in this shape and form only our human language is in humans, and nowhere else in the kingdom. So how did it come into being in the first place, right? That's one question you have to ask yourself. Second question is like, how much of language is influenced by our brain and the way our mind works, and how much is influenced by the fact that language is a living thing. We all speak, we all exchange words, and in that process a lot of pressures can work on shaping language, right? So what shapes language into this current form? And so I started doing, with the advent of AI, I started doing a lot of AI modeling. I can talk about, the modeling that we do in our lab, which is we're trying to create an artificial baby with these fancy new AI methods. And that can give you a bunch of answers as well, right? Because you can mimic human speech with these artificial neurons and then also compare them to real neurons. So that's one kind of external way you can look into on language and some of these more pressing and difficult questions. And then the other, of course, is other animals, right? So if you're serious about, like, how did language evolve, what language even is, what kind of differences do we see between our communication system and animal communication system? Of course, the natural thing is to go outside humans and look at what other animals have.
Right, right. So a general interest and understanding of what kind of thing language is, where did our languages come from, and it's kind of cool to highlight the kinds of things. So like you kind of think, well, AI is a pretty amazing tool then maybe to kind of get at these kinds of questions, and then pointing to as well how language is kind of one part of cognition, right? So as well, how can we sort of understand maybe the full range of what kind of things, what kind of thing makes our cognition possible? And it's interesting as well because language seems to be an important part, maybe a unique part of our cognition. But then, as you say, animals as well, though. To what degree even can we say it's language, right? And then if you kind of are going to those more base levels, that can kind of help us understand just a huge range of cognition, right?
Hmm. Yep, for sure. And some people think that language and thought are one of the same thing, pretty much. They're very intertwined. Some people think that there are inner thoughts are actually separate from our language. And so those are all the fascinating questions that one can ask if you're willing to study, all sorts of intelligences. And in a sense, what I usually say is that I study language in animals, humans, and machines, or cognition in animals and humans and machines, because right now it's exciting time to do that because for the first time we have AI that is so good that you have to take it seriously, and you actually can be a tool of a subject of study, and you can use some of the same methods and approaches that we've been using studying language on these models. And the other thing is, I think there's like renewed excitement for studying animal communication. For the longest, we thought that animals are this inferior creatures that and their communication systems are rather simple, or not as interesting. But I think there's like a renewed interest in really carefully, seriously study animals and their communication systems, or language trained animals. Not that that field has not been ongoing for several decades. It just, I think there's a really good excitement behind this efforts now.
It's interesting. Yeah, so language in animals, humans, machines, especially because I mean, so especially LLMs. I mean, they're literally called language models. I mean, and then their language capacities is pretty good. I mean, the way they write is it's kind of better than me, and I know I do more than just writing, but still that it's how well if given the AI and the fact that they're probably less simple, much more simple than us, but they have language. So then, what kind of thing is language? I remember the physicist, computer scientist Stephen Wolfram saying it's kind of a very interesting question that arises when AI uses language. What does it mean that language isn't as complex as we thought it was? Like what kind of thing does it say it
Right.
is when we see AI creating language?
Right. So, and that really, speaks to the question of evolution of language, right? So we don't know, there's a lot we don't know about how language evolved, right? And there are two kind of scenarios. It's possible that, we, just increase intelligence, you keep evolution going, and from, bonobos and chimpanzees who don't have the same language, with increase of computational power of our brain or increase of gray matter, whatever we want, you know, some way on the way there, language emerges and our communication system emerges. There's another possible scenario, which is something catastrophic happens, right? Something uniquely human happens, right? And then from animals we are completely different, all of a sudden, right? So you can think of it as this kind of continuation of increased intelligence that gives rise to language, and then another scenario is something uniquely, specifically human happens, and we maybe have adaptation in our brain that allows language. And the second scenario was popular for a long time, and a lot of linguists would subscribe to it, but these LLMs are really shaking up the ground, really causing us to rethink because um, with increase of power in their power, language like properties started to emerge. Now, it's difficult to say that they have language or not. I think this kind of a is more of a mute point because it depends on how you define language and what you make of it. But I think the fact is that these AI models can help us test these hypotheses, right? Because if you have a small model that doesn't do language really well and is bad at it, but then you increase its power, and what language emerges, and there's really impressive thing emerged, then you can say, well, it's not necessarily the case that humans underwent the same evolution, but the fact is that this mathematical in mathematical approximations of our brain, language can emerge, right? And so but there's a cat, right? So we all talk about LLMs and GPT-4 and whatnot. Um, those models have several biologically implausible aspects, right? No human baby learns from text, right? So no human baby is born and starts reading massive amounts of Wikipedia and Reddit. um, and so this is less realistic to how it's not a really realistic model. Also, humans learn by speaking and listening, right? And GPT and Llama and all these models used to just see words, text, characters in a computer program. So that's not also not how humans learn. Um, so we learn by imitation. The human baby, is born into this world and start babbling and starts producing sounds and hears back what the caregivers are saying. And so it's kind of really bi-directional communication, and there's a lot of interaction that happens between caregivers and human babies. So what we've been doing in our lab is, in a sense, acknowledge that LLMs can really help us understand lots of these big picture questions, but also there's a need to create a more realistic version of LLMs, right? So more realistic alternatives. So what we've been developing is using the same set of techniques to mathematically approximate human language or human brain to build a basically artificial language learner. Okay, so to build this in a sense artificial baby that only gets raw audio, so only hears words and needs to move articulators and needs to exchange information internally and externally in a similar way as human babies are interacting with the world. And with that, then you can really test not only what is possible in these artificial neural networks, what can AI do, but also you can test it, how does it do it, right? And parallel that to humans. Does it do something similarly than we do, or are there any important differences? And of course, those important differences is what's going to tell you what can be uniquely human about language, right? So I think there's a really valid question, which is what is human about our language, and it's a tough question. So in a sense, we need to get as many evidence as possible. So borrowing from machine learning, borrowing from animal studies is really helpful in this type of questions.
Hmm. It's interesting, you say that obviously the way humans learn, play and just taking objects, looking at them in those different ways, and just it's not just reading text on Reddit, and that's a good thing. But then we have language from that, and yet it's interesting though when you say have an LLM and you only train it on text, then it can also eventually get to writing. And it's interesting you mentioned as well. I mean, at first, I guess we just didn't even know it's necessarily possible, right? It's complete kind of. It's just they weren't very good at first, but like we have them and now it's super competent. And then it would be interesting that you say, well, like, what is the minimum requirements to get kind of language? And I know we can get into what kind of do we mean? Like, do they understand the language they have? But it seems that there is like this legible text, right? So could you get that from audio? I mean, especially because with LLMs, you train them on text, and then it's quite easy to train them to on images to then
Mhm.
them create images. So it's like, what did they learn from
Mhm.
the text? And then so then equally, like maybe we have language from our complex experience, but could it be the case that you can get language from something at minimum, like fewer requirements, right? And then
Mhm.
what does that look like when that entity has language, and then that can sort of help us understand language in a
Right.
way.
And I think the key what you mentioned is what do they learn, right? And how do they learn internally, okay? And an interesting thing is again, LLMs are really powerful. And one of the studies that we have is we were able to show that these really large good models, for the first time in history, basically, we have a case where a model can analyze language itself, right? Not only it can produce language, not only can say valid sentences in English, but if you ask it, use linguistic tools very explicitly. Use linguistic tools. Use the tools that we scientists have been using for centuries to describe language. Analyze the sentence, and it'll do it, right? So this is really this kind of higher level, right? A kid can know how to speak years before they can know what a noun and a verb is, and how those dependencies work. And that's there's a science of linguistics behind that has been dealing that for centuries. um, and for the first time an LLM can do that. And but the crucial thing is we need to understand internally how these models are learning. And that is so important for all sorts of reasons. There's a lot of talk about AI safety, there's a lot of talk about regulation, and just in general. Um, so these large LLMs are, in a sense, so big that it's difficult to understand them, and it's difficult to look inside them, right? So we have this sort of approaches like the one I just mentioned. We use, for example, linguistics to try to get as get a window into its internal representations. On the other hand, if you build more realistic model, they're going to be smaller, right? They're going to be more brain-like. They're um, more inspired by our brain, and so you can understand them much better and look inside them much better. Okay, so not only you can look inside, not only you can train a model, develop a model that has several realistic properties, train it on human speech, see whether it behaves like human babies when they're acquire language, and we've shown several times that they do. But also, you can look inside them, right? Look inside these artificial mathematical approximations of our brain and see this is how it learns. So, this is how it, this neuron, this artificial neuron represents something that I know is important in language. And then what you can do in addition to that is, you take human brain, of course, and there are several ways to scan human brain, right? So one is with, you place electrodes, tiny electrodes on people's brain. The other is MRI, where you put people into a giant magnetic field. A third is when, during surgery, sometimes patients need to be awake and you can record the brain activity there. So you can use those really interesting brain imaging techniques to parallel behavior, not only behavior, not only how, the way these models are behaving like humans or unlike humans, but also internally at the brain level, at the neuron level, are we similar and different or different? And so I think that's really crucial for all sorts of purposes. And finally, this ability to look inside the network is really powerful. Why? Because these networks are really good, right, at producing sentences, at answering questions, and all sorts of tasks. And so, if you're able to look inside them, how they learn, then you're able to get insights that as a human you might not have, right? So, that's the crucial thing as kind of AI interpretability as a source of new discovery.
And so, if I understand that, so if you were to create a model that's smaller and say, what would it mean to make a small AI instead of making it enormous, but you don't really understand it? What would it mean to have elements that are brain-like, and you could then map out and better understand it? How would that look like?
Well, we're trying to do that. We've been showing that our brain signal, the signal in our brain when we listen to speech is very, very similar to the signal in these artificial neural networks, and in pure raw form. So you can make all sorts of comparisons. You can make, you can build simulations, stuff that is impossible in humans for ethical reasons. So you can, you can develop this artificial network and artificially take some weights out, or artificially black out parts of it to see what kind of mistakes it'll make. One of my students were just presenting this yesterday in our lab meeting. So he was blacking out parts of the artificial brain to see what kind of words it'll produce. And you obviously can't do that in human brain. So you can use this as a kind of simulation to better understand the brain and our processing. We're showing that. Um, so when you listen to me right now, your eardrum is vibrating, and that gets translated into electric activity, and that travels through your brainstem first, and then onto the outer part of your brain. Okay, and so you can catch that signal. You can catch words as they're traveling through the brain, and also you can catch words as they're traveling through artificial neural networks. And we've been showing that earlier stages in this process are similar between artificial neural networks and brain. Later stages is also similar. So there's like this similar process, and so you can use all sorts of simulations to basically ask questions or answer questions that you wouldn't be able to answer. Of course, this is all modeling, right? So it's not exactly the same. Our brain operate in several ways differently, but we're getting closer and closer, and I think this is the closest we can currently get given our methodology.
So with a simpler model, but you can then see the analogies between the yeah, how that is processing information, and then our brains that can tell us about what are the elements, the important elements to understand how hearing sort of works, and what kinds of things, I mean, have we learned, and do you think we can learn from this kind of method? Like, what does the future look like? I guess that's
Well,
I
so
probably yeah, gone.
I mentioned, right, it's understanding these models is super crucial because Humans are very biased. We don't like to think of ourselves as biased, but very biased, right? There's like several layers of bias. We don't even hear things that are not within certain frequency range, right? We don't hear rats and high frequencies, for example, above 20,000 hertz. Um, we see a certain spectrum of light and so on. But we are also biased in other ways because we're biological creatures, and as scientists, we are still biological creatures, right? We're not this independent, creatures, and when we turn our scientist hat on. So we are able to observe certain patterns, and not others. Okay, so now if we build these artificial neural networks, and if we understand them, it means that we can build an intelligence that is able to see way more than we are, or maybe not more, but different things. Okay, it can observe different patterns, it can hear different things, it can, it doesn't have the same set of biological predispositions. And you know, you know, for example, to me, as a human, I really like faces, right? Our brain really like faces, and we can train a model that doesn't necessarily have preference towards faces, can find other things, for example, on a picture. Now, if you also understand, if you're able to see how then this model has learned, this less biased model has learned, you can get insights into new insights that you wouldn't have got if you haven't if you didn't have that tool. So this is kind of a AI as a tool, AI interpretability as a tool for new discovery. And this is really interesting because, for example, when we were looking at other right, so we have our artificial baby, okay? It learned language in a way that we think is good, right? It discovered on its own what is important in language. It discovered words, it discovered sound on a completely on its own. And so if you're faced with something that you don't understand, for example, animal communication, you can train such a model not on human speech but on animal speech or animal communication, and then look inside it and see, okay, what about animals did you learn? And so that is a nice approach, basically, where you can kind of you can find new patterns with AI interpretability. And if we are able to pair this understanding of the models with their amazing performance, I think there's going to be a ton of new discoveries in science, which is really exciting. And it's not just me; other scientists are excited about the potential to use this technology as a tool for new discovery.
Right. Now, I was going to turn that back onto animal language because developing kind of AI tools that can see kinds of things that we're not predisposed to or literally can't see, like a spectrum of light that we cannot see, and so, I mean, if animals have language or like the intricacies of their communication, I mean, we as humans are not have not been evolved or created to
Mm.
understand animal language. So even if it's there, how are we gonna see it, right? But if you can, create an AI and it's like that's its job, it's specialized, it's been learning to understand animal language. So that's, I mean, but yeah, more broadly, it's so interesting to kind of turn these tools back around on science itself to kind of give you new lenses and sort of ways of seeing the world.
Right, for sure. Yeah, no, it's I think there's, and not only in animal communication research. So this approach of building AI, getting outside of our human with the help of which we'll get outside of our human biases is huge. And it can tell us it has like really deep philosophical implications, right? So what does it mean to be human, right? And what does it mean to be intelligent? That those are really difficult questions. And what does it mean to be sentient and conscious and stuff like that. So there's gonna be a lot, but I think we're gonna have to we really need to study all these intelligences together, right? Animals, humans, and machines, in order to mutually benefit from the study of these intelligences. For example, like we can learn about how language evolved by learning how, by running this simulation of artificial babies. We can learn um, how these machines learn by using the same techniques that linguists have been using for centuries of trying to, understand our symbolic language and the way we communicate. And we can learn about animals by, training these models um, on things that and helping us, helping us see patterns that we wouldn't have otherwise. So I think it's really exciting to kind of use all these three universes, if you want, to get new insights.
What have we learned about animal communication then using these kinds of techniques?
Well, I think it's really at the beginning. So I have a bunch of research. It's available on my website on what kind of models we can use, what the techniques are. So we have developed several techniques that help us look inside the models. I think animal communication is a really complex nut to crack. With some exceptions, there's a lot of systems that we really don't know yet. And not only because we don't have good AI systems, or because we're not good at getting outside of our humanity. It is also because we don't have a ton of data, right? Animals in captivity have been studied, but animals in the wild have not been studied as much. It's not easy to study elephants or bonobos or chimpanzees and or whales. Um, in the wild. And so it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time, right? So for example, I'm part of Project SETI, and we've been following sperm whales, and it's such a big undertaking, right? These animals live in the wild. They live on deep sea. They dive up to a kilometer deep, so they need the open sea, and open sea research is tough. So we don't have a ton of data. Elephants, likewise, right? So, or bonobos and chimpanzees are endangered. So, following them in the wild takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, and not always is the scientific community interested enough. And I think now there's like really a renewed excitement about this kind of research, but it's not just because we don't have fancy models. It's also because we haven't been attentive enough, if we haven't been listening to these animals enough, we just didn't put enough effort into trying to understand them.
Right. It's like if we had the kind of data on whales that we have on our language, I mean, you probably have cracked it, right? But where are the data sets? Where can you find the data sets on like sperm whale noises? Yes,
Like, and
we have
and
to
and
make them.
not
Yeah.
only that, not only that, right? We share with elephants and chimpanzees. At least we share habitat, right? I can think of my 3D world, right? There are trees, and elephants have trees as well, and there's like floor, and there's gravity, and there's air, right? With whales, it's like almost everything is upside down. Their gravity works different. I mean, gravity works the same, but like they just float most of the time. They sleep vertically, for example, which is really cool. Um, it's mostly dark below 700 meters in the ocean, and it's just like it's difficult to conceptualize their world, even, right? How do they present? How do they imagine the world, right? You get into these really deep philosophical questions, um, and they really make you rethink a lot of assumptions that you have as a terrestrial animal. But yeah, so it's really difficult to represent their world. On the other hand, on some levels, they're so similar to us, right? As well, right? Their females form societies, matrilineal societies, um, and they, babysit each other's calves, and they form families and clans, and they use communication system to mark their identity. And so on some levels, they're very similar. And kids are with the female families for a long time. They are acquiring their communication system. So on many levels, very similar, but and think of like how their world is so different. And that's really this excitement behind the study of them, I think, is because of these similarities and differences.
Mm. It's, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Levin's work on kind of, for example, the intelligence of single-celled organisms or organs in our body in general. Like what kind of intelligences are out there, but we apply our humanistic sort of reasoning and we think, it doesn't look intelligent to me. It looks kind of dumb. Well, are you sure? If you do you know the kind of intelligence that it has? And it's because and you say with the whales, right? I mean, they're navigating a situation that might be complete darkness. What is that? We're so used to trying to use our eyes as a
Mm,
means for intelligence, and so it's like, yeah, different kinds of intelligence that we kind of then don't spot as intelligence.
right. And they dive. As they dive, they echolocate, right? So they emit these clicks, and based on what comes back, they kind of probably form this representations of the world behind below them. And they also hunt. They locate squid, which is their main food. But yeah, no. I mean, I think there's gonna be a lot of attention moved now onto a study of intelligences and different flavors and different sorts and just trying to understand what intelligence is and how we can use different different subtypes of intelligences together to kind of move forward and make progress.
What do you think AI will look like in the future, especially because you talked about the LLMs, they're kind of intelligence, but like they don't really seem to have that many analogies to our kinds of intelligence. They're just really humongous linear kind of feed forward models. But then there are also AI being created with a bit more focus on the
Mm.
principles of human cognition. And yeah, I'm wondering, I mean, the multiple routes, I mean, what I mean, also, yeah, there's so many
Yeah,
questions here. Yeah.
that I mean, it's a really interesting and deep problem. And there's camps, right? As always, there's camps. Some people think that AI is great. It's great as a tool. It'll never surpass human. It will never have that capacity. And the other camp is, of course, a little bit more cautious. And recently, Jeffrey Hinton got a Nobel Prize, and he's very cautious. And I would probably fall more into the second camp if you want to place me. So I don't want to be a doomer or anything, but the fact is that artificial intelligence has some pretty big advantages over human intelligence because it's non-biological. Okay, so if you think of a human, right? I'm born and I need to learn everything from scratch, and then as humans we pass away. Um, and my brain cannot be taken out of my currently cannot be taken out and implemented into another brain, right? Whereas with AI models, basically you can copy weights, copy this artificial brain, and continuously train them. And you can make intelligences that collaborate, right? So far we've been focusing on single LLM, right? GPT-4. But like imagine a future where there's like where these models start collaborating within each other, right? And we know that one human is so can be so intelligent, but like 10 humans are much more intelligent than than a single one, and it's oftentimes not. It's oftentimes even more than the sum of the parts, right? Because this kind of collective intelligence emerges. So I think we need to be very careful. I think it's something that needs attention, and I'm not saying that they're gonna take over. And there's not some sort of sci-fi scenarios, but there are some advantages that we need to be quite careful about. And nobody really knows what will happen. Nobody knows if there's a limit. But the question that we are asking, the question that you just asked, what will AI look like, is incredibly connected to the question of how animals work and how human language emerged, right? So the question is there the question that I started this podcast with was, what is uniquely human? Did something really uniquely human happen in our evolution that allows us to be so intelligent, that allows us to have language, or was just increase in computational power? Now, you asked me the exact same question here, slightly differently packaged, but if I'm continuously growing these networks, are we gonna see, just continuous improvement until like they're better than us at one point? Or is there something uniquely human and unique architecture that is required for the models to be as successful as we are? So that's why it's so important to also, look at animals and look at humans to answer this question. Nobody really knows, but there's less and less evidence that there is something uniquely human. And if you think of, the brain of a fly was just recently sequenced, the brain of a fly, of a fruit fly, all
Like
140
all
all
neurons, right? Okay, interesting.
140,000 neurons were recently, flashed out and analyzed in a Nature paper. Their brain is very different than ours, but it works according to the same principles, right? And so if you imagine the fruit fly's brain and just, you know, stretch it to our neurons, which is like 80 billion and several trillions of, hundreds of trillions of synapses, then, you have in a sense, a comparison. Somewhere along those lines, humanness arose, right? Somewhere along those lines, animal language emerged, our intelligence emerged. So if you think of, if you put a parallel to AI, if we're going to keep increasing and under the assumption that performance will increase, then at some point we're going to have a really capable entity. And the only thing that humans have not dealt with in the past has been something that is more intelligent than us. We basically dealt with, we dealt with uh, uh, atomic crisis, we dealt with wars, we dealt with horrible things more or less successfully, but we never had anything that was more intelligent than us. So it's basically a complete uncharted territory. And so that for all these reasons, I would say caution is in place, and not the kind of caution that where you freak out that in 10 years we're going to be wiped out by these models, but we have to rethink our future in a sense, which we didn't have to rethink 10 years ago when these models were not as successful yet.
And it makes me think. I mean, you can't really separate the AI from us and our intelligence. So I mean, people themselves equipping themselves technologically with the power of all these AI LLMs, and as you say, multiple of them in combination, or companies, these other distributed entities, right? Like even if it's like I guess what I'm saying is we will be part of the both the benefits but also the problems, right? It'll be kind of to a degree us wielding it or us facilitating them, and so and it's interesting, to tie that into intelligence. It's like the different kinds to it. It's hard to spot sometimes, right? And so it's like, what kinds of new kinds of even intelligence could, and it's almost saying that you're going to make an LLM with a new kind of intelligence, but then again, the combination of different kinds of AI, right? And as we learn more about them, right? It's
Well,
interesting.
and these models can start communicating in ways that we don't understand. And that's probably likely going to happen, actually. So, we have our own language, which is rather slow. You and I talk with about 39 bits per second information exchange rate. And imagine those days of when internet was 39 bits per second. Those are those are long past. And imagine if our internet connections were so slow these days. And so that's whenever I as a human I raise I get born. I need to learn everything with this slow rate. That's something that Jeffrey Hinton is also saying about. Um, and these models have way bigger channels. So in a sense we're slow, and they're gonna be able to maybe these models can start communicating with each other in ways we don't understand. So I think it's super important to continue the research into interpretability, into understanding these models, and trying to see what can happen, so that in the best case scenario we get um, we get a tool that is super helpful, and that I'm sure will happen. In the next couple of decades, there's a big potential for all sorts of discovery for in medicine, in all sorts of fields because of all these things we talked about. Um, the question is like how and when it can get to a point where these models are performing too well and we don't understand them and cannot control them, right? And that is something that I think, you know, there's a lot of, in a sense, political debates behind this, but I don't think it should be, right? I mean, you can disagree whether that's a valid reason or not, but I think there's nothing wrong to think about these potential future scenarios that can be, really bad for the humanity, um, just because there are so many advantages that these models have, right? And if you think of it, we humans are very creative and we're very curious and we're very great at dealing with problems and so it's going to be a big challenge if we're able to control these models or create them in a way that we can still understand them. That is the crucial part. So that's what I'm investing so much of my effort into interpretability. Because if you don't understand what the model starts saying, right? If at some point you don't understand what it's performing because it's in a sense more intelligent then you have a problem. And recently it happened that one of the greatest mathematicians, Terence Tao, said that the latest model is at the level of a not fully incompetent graduate student in mathematics, right? And that is to me a pretty pretty high estimation. So the models have started, to working on proofs, and they're not perfect yet, but they're increasingly, getting better and better. So I think one has to be really really careful and attentive to these things, and I think it shouldn't be the case that this kind of calls for caution and calls for understanding should be met with this sort of skepticism and this kind of you know attitude. Oh, this is just doomerism, and this is really inappropriate.
And that concludes this podcast. If you liked it, then maybe check out one of these videos here and consider subscribing for more like this in the future. I'm Jack, and thank you for watching.